Hi, welcome. Welcome to the Eastside Freedom Library. Thanks for joining us this evening. For folks who are here in person, thanks for being here on this nice pre-summer weather that we are having. And also appreciate folks who are tuning in online as well. Um, my name is Sangmani Labut. I am the executive director here at the Eastside Freedom Library. If this is your first time here in this space, welcome. So the Eastside Freedom Library is an independent nonprofit organization. Our work is around the intersection of African American history, immigration history, labor history, and social movements. Our mission is to inspire solidarity, advocate for justice, and work towards equity for all. And one of the many ways that we fulfill our mission is to promote and preserve knowledge about our surrounding communities, histories, residents, institutions, through educational collections, but also programs like the one we are having tonight. Um, and stories is a very is essential theme to our work here at the Eastside Freedom Library. Um, and the telling and gathering of stories through public programming, performances, exhibits, like the one we have today. Um, Hold on, Bailey, are we having technical issue? Okay, thank you so much. Um, so we do that through programming, performance, and exhibits as well. In the coming months, the Eastside Freedom Library will be celebrating our 10th anniversary. It has been a long decade for us in building this institution, and we will be launching our programming for with a year long series. And with the year long series, we will be doing some programming around the theme of love and solidarity. Love for our neighbors and community, but also how do we bring folks together as well. So over the past decade, the Eastside Freedom Library has become a very vibrant hub of knowledge, a place where community can gather and learn, but also a place where the library has become a place as a sanctuary for knowledge and the offering of unique and valued perspective and the struggles and triumphs that we are and contributions of diverse community that we are having. And so we see nationwide around the banning books and banning knowledge. And so we as an organization, um, you know, has really become a sanctuary for that as well. And appreciate folks who are partnering with us, the speakers for today as well, to help us really fulfill our mission and the value of the organization. And so, before I really move on with introducing our speakers, I want to offer a few technical instructions for our virtual audience. If you have questions for our speakers throughout the entire program tonight, folks who are viewing through Zoom, you can enter them through the Zoom Q&A feature. If you are tuning in through Facebook Live, please enter your questions on a comment box with the letter Q in front of your questions. And we have a team here working on to gather some of those questions for our speakers. Um, and so, this evening's event really brings together some of our friends and supporter of the Eastside Freedom Library. We have with us David Mura. No need for long introduction with David, but I'll give a little introduction. And so David is no stranger to the literary scene and social movements, both locally and nationally. David is a memoirist, essayist, novelist, poet, critic, playwright, and performance artist. David Mura's newest book is right here. The stories whiteness tell its The Stories Whiteness Tell Itself, Racial Myths and Our American Narratives, published by the University of Minnesota Press. His latest book, his last book was A Stranger's Journey, Race, Identity, and Narrative Craft in Writing. His two memoirs are Turning Japanese, memoirs of Sansei, third generation Japanese American. and it's a New York Times notable book, and also Where the Body Meets Memory, an Odyssey of Race, Sexuality, and Identity. Um, so tonight, David will be doing a reading of his book, The Stories Whiteness Tell Itself, Racial Myths in Our American Narratives. And then David will be in conversation with our other guest speaker, Shannon Gibney, afterwards. And so also Shannon doesn't need a long introduction, a great friend of our organization as well. Shannon is a writer, educator, activist, and the author of See No Color and Dream Country, both are young adult novels that won Minnesota Book Awards in 2016 and 2019, respectively. Shannon Gibney is faculty in English at Minneapolis College, where she teaches writing. Um, she's also a Bush artist and McKnight Writing Fellow. Her newest novel, The Girl I Am, Was, and Never Will Be, also explores themes of transracial adoption through speculative memoir. So thank you, and if you can please help me welcome our speaker, David.
Here's Shannon's novel. Okay. I want to thank Sang and Clarence and Eastside Freedom Library for having me here. It's a real pleasure. It's such a wonderful place. I just love coming here. Just so many things you just pass. I mean the poster for Philando Castile up there, the lyrics from a Bessie Smith song downstairs, the Jacob Lawrence art in the bathroom, and I'm standing right here next to the James Baldwin section, the Hmong art here. This is such a treasure for the community. And, I had this thought tonight, like, Ron DeSantis would hate this place. But then I think, like, why would they hate it? This is such a beautiful place. It's one of the things in a way, my book explores. And I'm going to read mainly from the introduction to give you an idea of this book. Race in America has long been framed as a black-white dialogue and struggle. That dialogue and struggle are the subject of this book. And I come to race as a Sansei, a third-generation Japanese American. That term places me within a specific ethnic and racial history. During World War II, as a result of Executive Order 9066, my parents and grandparents were imprisoned by the United States government in Jerome, Arkansas, and Minidoka, Idaho, two of the internment camps placed throughout desolate areas of the American West and South. Born in Seattle and Los Angeles, my parents were citizens, and they were just 11 and 15 when incarcerated behind barbed wire fences and rifle towers with armed guards. My immigrant grandparents were barred by racist laws from becoming citizens or owning land. No Japanese American was ever convicted of espionage, and there's evidence that the FBI determined the Japanese American community was not a military threat. And yet 120,000 mainland Japanese Americans were imprisoned without a trial or a writ of habeas corpus and denied their basic constitutional rights. In 1988, President Ronald Reagan and the U.S. Congress apologized to the Japanese American community for their unjust imprisonment. Both Reagan and the Congress admitted that the real cause of the camps was not military necessity, but, quote, racism, wartime hysteria, and a failure of leadership. Unfortunately, in our current Trumpian America, the lessons of that apology have again been forgotten. The internment of Japanese Americans and the racism that caused it are now mirrored by present-day anti-immigrant sentiment, xenophobia, and religious bigotry. And the internment has been cited by certain conservatives as a precedent for any number of anti-immigrant and anti-Muslim measures. So one of the things I talk about as I go on with this is just that my parents understood, both consciously and unconsciously, that their crime was their race and ethnicity. I mean, they were 11, 15. They hadn't obviously done anything. And the same thing was not done to the German American community, though Germany was our enemy. It was not done to the Italian American community, though Italy was our enemy. So it was racial, and they raised me to sort of assimilate into a white middle class identity. And it was really only in my late 20s that I began reading black authors, and I realized, first of all, there was a language to talk about race, a language that I had never learned as a PhD student in English, studying for 5 years the entire Anglo American canon, which at the time was defined as entirely made up of white authors. And so, reading these black authors, I realized, oh, I'm not white. I'm never going to be white. What the hell am I? And I had to go back and examine what it meant to be a Japanese American, examine the implications of the internment camps, which my parents never talked about, and began a lifelong study of the issues of race in America. Though that was my initial subject and has been through all of my adult writing life after my late 20s, I don't think I would have imagined I would have written a book like this. It's a product of many years of study and work. So I start this book with an essay on the death in 2016 of an African American man. Philando Castile was shot and killed by a police officer in a routine traffic stop in a near suburb of St. Paul. The site of the shooting is not more than a couple miles from my home, and it's a notorious speed trap. I've driven down that stretch of Larpenteur Avenue hundreds of times and even gotten a couple tickets for speeding. But I don't think I've ever been in danger there in ways Castile was obviously in danger. Because of my proximity to the site of Castile's murder, and because I know people who knew him and know members of the black community in St. Paul, his life and death felt particularly close to me. But the implications of his death are more than local, and the reasons why he was killed stem back to the beginnings of this country. His murder can be seen as a direct result of the ways that whites have enforced and interpreted the dictates of race, the ways whites have tried to script not only their own lives, but the lives of people of color. As I began to examine the implications of Castile's murder and the killings of Michael Brown in Ferguson, Freddie Gray in Baltimore, and other killings that sparked the Black Lives Movement, it confirmed my belief that our inability to deal with our racial disparities and injustice stem in part from the inadequacy of the language we use to examine and define racism. I reread the essays of James Baldwin and toured a course on his writing, tracing the development of his thinking and his incisive dissections not just of contemporary America, but of America's depiction of the past. That in turn led me back into our racial history from slavery onward, and the ways that history still structures and inhabits our present racial realities and narratives on race. And though I had been reading about race in literature all my adult life and had taught creative writing workshops on writing about race, I found myself now poring over recent studies in the history of race, the philosophy of race, psychology in race, political science in race, linguistics in race, economics in race, all the while moving deeper and deeper in the origins and lineage of whiteness. What is whiteness? It is far more multifaceted than many recognize. In part, it consists of prescriptions and prohibitions for white behavior and thought, a set of do's and don'ts and beliefs about our society. These behaviors and beliefs have served to protect and preserve the racial status quo from the very beginning of America. The ways power is distributed unequally and undemocratically in our society through the categories of race. Here, our history and our stories of the past come to have greater effect on contemporary America than is generally acknowledged. How we narrate and interpret our racial past structures how we narrate and interpret our racial present. So the idea that our racial past is past and has no relationship to the present is something which I think is specious and I'm arguing against in this book. Now, as we all know, I mean, there's been so many controversies of critical race theory, of the teaching of race in our schools. There's been banning of books. There's been the DeSantis banning of the AP African American History course. And it's very clear that many white Americans want to just hear an unblemished tale of our history, which leaves out significant chunks of what our racial history has been, the actions and thoughts and beliefs of white people of various different eras, but also, obviously, the narratives, consciousness, and experiences of African Americans. So, when I was a kid, I imbibed all of these myths about whiteness. I'm old enough that I watched all those black and white movies of Lincoln, watched those black and white movies of Custer and John Wayne fighting Native Americans. I identified with all of that history. I thought Andrew Jackson was a great president. Because all I understood was a Charlton Heston, a portrait of Andrew Jackson. So it's only later in life that I began to question this history. And of course, my family's part of that history is still not taught in many of our schools. Now, thanks to an ethnic studies course, which has now been legislated by the legislature, and I have to say, my daughter, Samantha Mura, sponsored that bill because she's a legislator from the sewer district in Minneapolis. And she said, my dad didn't grow up learning about the internment camps in school. I didn't learn about the internment camps in school, and I want to make sure my son, Tadashi, learns about the internment camps and our racial history. From its very beginnings, From its very beginnings, America had two irreconcilable goals. One was to seek equality, freedom, and democracy. The other was to maintain white supremacy and the domination by white people over any people of color. White America is fine with telling our tale through the lens of the first goal, but it is still decidedly not fine with telling the second story of America's treatment of people of color and America's desire to maintain white supremacy. All the recent ridiculous distorting, disparaging, and damning of critical race theory are just the latest manifestation of this repression. Instead, the second tale, the tale of BIPOC America, is regarded as un-American, unpatriotic, a smear on the past, an abomination to the present, or at best, a minor element. According to some, this story can never be integrated with the story of America's noble pursuit of its ideal goals. And this is an essential way white America has lied to itself. It has denied the voices of people of color as an essential and defining part of America's tale. It has denied their validity as Americans. It has denied that their history is also the history of white America. However, white America wants to deny that fact. For the story of white America cannot be understood without comprehending how inextricably and intrinsically that story is intertwined and united with the story of Black America, of Indigenous America, of Americans of color. Arkansas Senator Tom Cotton can describe slavery as a quote-unquote necessary evil that is safely in our past and needs no further reference. Cotton was in part responding to a curriculum based on the 1619 Project, a new origin story of the New York Times, which placed the initiation of slavery and its after effects as central to the telling of the American story. In a revealing example of how systemic racism works, Senator Cotton concocted a bill, the Saving American History Act, whose purpose was, quote unquote, to prohibit federal funds from being made available to teach the 1619 Project curriculum in elementary schools and secondary schools and for other purposes. According to Cotton, the project, quote, threatens the integrity of the Union by denying the true principles on which it was founded. Okay? Just as an aside, there has been so much controversy about wokeness, right? And there was this woman about a month and a half ago who wrote an anti-woke book, and she was asked to define what woke is, and she couldn't define it. Now, fortunately or unfortunately, the DeSantis administration has defined wokeness as the belief that there is systemic injustice in America. So you cannot even entertain the question of whether there is systemic racial injustice or class injustice or systemic injustice against any number of marginalized populations, the LGBT community, the immigrant population. None of that can be considered systemic. And yet, when you make a law which forbids the teaching of the 1619 curriculum, that's systemic. In arguing this, Cotton illustrates a common racist trope. Whiteness makes itself the victim of its own crimes and then tells that tale to itself. I'll repeat it. Whiteness makes itself the victim of its own crimes and then tells a tale to itself. Cotton transforms any statement of the fact that white people have been abusing black people since 1619 into a threat to white people, not to black people. After all, it's not black people who think the 1619 Project is a threat to our union. Frankly, as my burb suggests, this is an abuser's psychology on a group level. The problem is that the problem isn't what white people have done to black people, but that black people keep remembering what white people have done. And somehow that harms white people and victimizes them. To which black people might reply, if we can remember and live with the past and what your ancestors have done to our ancestors, why is it you can't remember and live with the same past? Are you that fragile? Unfortunately, the tales of white victimhood go back to slavery. Slavery is not an act of terror, only the slavery rebellion was. Specifically, Cotton objected to the project's assertion that the introduction of slavery could be seen as the creation of America's racial categories and thus the definition of whiteness, and that this could then be viewed as the origin of America. He also objected to the assertion by many historians that part of the reason the colonists declared their independence from Britain was to ensure the preservation of slavery. In other words, Cotton is perfectly fine with telling the story of America through the lens of the principles of equality, freedom, and democracy and white heroism. But he cannot countenance the story of America where white supremacy is initiated and maintained and plays a central and inextricable role in our history. He wants to wish away or legislate away the fact that this activity was supported by many of those whites whom he regards as heroes. In viewing slavery as a necessary evil, Cotton can assert this without really examining whether slavery was truly necessary or how deeply evil it was and what the evil entailed. In particular, how it helped formulate white identity. Historian Dave Eltis argues that it would have been far cheaper to take slaves out of European prisons and poorhouses. But one of the reasons why they didn't do this, it would cast a stain on whiteness. It would disrupt white unity. And so the ability to group white people as a group which is privileged would have been lost. Certainly in blithely proclaiming the necessity of slavery, Cotton is not regarding as primary, utterly boring, the destruction of black lives and bodies and families. He doesn't want to think about those black lives, and that is why he objects to the New York Times 1619 Project. Certainly, he does not see the story of black Americans as his story, too. And if you cannot face clearly the more obvious and egregious racism of the past and the way it destroyed black lives, how can you see and face the damage and destruction of black lives and what Cotton believes is a less racist present? Now, I want to say here that from the start, that I did not write this book, and I don't speak on the issues of race in order to shame and guilt white people. I firmly believe we change people through knowledge and love. But we don't know our history. We have not examined it. We have not examined the implications of our history. And so, to me, it is not about the individual consciousness of any individual white person. It's whether there is a systemic racism in this society and how it works. And that it works on a much more complicated and deeper level than we realize. Yeah, I'll just read a couple more paragraphs. Part of what I talk about in the book is that one of the things we don't study is a racial backlash. So that every time in our history when there was ostensibly legal progress towards black equal rights, there was a immediate and vehement and well thought out, organized effort to return everything to the previous state. So after blacks were emancipated from slavery, you have this whole effort during Reconstruction to take away the rights of black citizens, and it led to the establishment of the Jim Crow system. But you can see the same thing happening in the Civil Rights era. There are because what happened was, okay, we can't legally segregate, so we're going to create a whole system of private and religious schools in the South, and we're going to be able to maintain segregation. And in many southern cities, there's as much segregation in the school systems as there was back in the 1960s when the civil rights laws were enacted. So it is this history of racial backlash which we don't understand or know about, which is why people can be confused about why it is that we had a black president and then was followed by Donald J. Trump, okay? Which is another instance of our historical backlash. I'll read just a few sentences about that. The question of those who oppose racial progress was how to accomplish their backlash under each new seemingly progressive legal dispensation. Resistant whites understood that they could not acknowledge their true intentions, or at least they could not declare them openly. When it comes to racism, hypocrisy is a deliberate strategy, historian David Blight has observed. A basic premise throughout our history is that racism will defend itself through often hard-to-detect intellectual sleights of hand, through camouflaging its workings and creating concepts and premises designed to make racism difficult or impossible to prove. And one of those definitions is one that we still commonly use, which is racism only takes place when somebody makes an act of hatred or discrimination that is obvious, and then not only that, but declares that that's why they're doing it, right? Because as long as you restrict black voting rights and you go, I'm doing it for geographical reasons or, for reasons of religious reasons or whatever reason you can come up that's not race, then it's not racist. Now, this is not a definition that people of color would come up with. It's just not one we would agree with. And so it's at the level of, because you've created a definition, because even members of the KKK will not say I'm acting on racist beliefs. So if you created a definition where racism doesn't even exist in the society, and that allows you to say racism no longer exists because nobody openly declares I'm a racist, so the problem is over. Which obviously it is not. I would propose that the themes of this book are fairly straightforward and readily understandable. In the history of America's racial ontology, white people have created the categories of whiteness and blackness, and those categories continue to structure white identity. That identity is in part based on a belief in the myths, false histories, and racially segregated fictional stories white people tell themselves about themselves. That is, the stories whiteness tells itself, especially about our history, are not an accurate portrait of our history, and yet they continue to structure white identity, i.e., white psychology, in the present. That identity is a psychological distortion based on a denial of what white people have done in our past and what they continue to do in the present. Part of that distortion involves the creation of unblemished white heroes and a version of our history that ameliorates, downplays, or excludes the depths of white racism and white supremacy in our history. Part of that distortion also involves the ways in which white history diminishes or exercises blackness from our history. In other words, that identity distorts and occludes the actual lives and consciousness of black people in our history, what black people have done and accomplished, what they have suffered and continue to suffer, how they tell their stories. This occurs not just through the content of the stories whiteness tells itself, but through the structures of these stories, structures that often function more at an unconscious rather than conscious level. In both conscious and unconscious ways, white identity and the stories it tells segregate and separate, wall off white people from the reality of black people, their history and experience, the truths black people have to tell about who we have been as a country and who we are now. White identity thus denies, excludes, and attacks the validity of black knowledge and the stories blacks tell themselves. It deems black epistemology, which is the study of knowledge, as secondary, minor, extraneous, or invalid, as subjective and always open to an objective white judgment and dismissal. Whiteness must always be epistemologically superior to blackness, and that is one of the basic principles or rules of white identity. Now, when I'm speaking about whiteness, I'm speaking about an ideology, a set of rules, beliefs, practices that govern white behavior. And often children, when they're young, they don't act according to these rules. They don't see color. They don't see race. They are not racist. They learn this, right? So it's not genetically inherent to white people, but it is something that people learn. And the idea, white knowledge, and the reason why I have to use the term like epistemology is in this evaluation knowledge, white knowledge is always valid, objective, true, and official. White knowledge is always valid, objective, true, and official. And black knowledge is always invalid, subjective, false or suspicious, and unofficial, unless white people decree it is official. Now, you see this when DeSantis banishes the AP history course, which is created by African American scholars and writers. Right? He's not an African American writer. He's not an African American scholar. He doesn't have a PhD in African American studies, but he feels perfectly qualified to say this course is not educational. Now, that we don't think about the history, but what happened when the Africans were enslaved and brought to America? They were forced not to speak their language. They were not allowed to tell their culture and history. So what is DeSantis doing? He's forbidding African American writers and scholars from teaching their history, their culture. Isn't it the same thing? But we don't see it as the same thing. And we have to recognize that this rule about knowledge is something which governs the whole society. It's there in the emergency room when black patients wait longer than white patients for this pain medication for the same condition. It's there when not just that black Americans are arrested the 3.64 more times, at a rate 6.64 times more than whites for smoking marijuana for the exact same crime, because we know that white Americans and black Americans smoke marijuana at the exact same rate. But then when black Americans are arrested, they're more likely to go to trial, more likely to be convicted, more likely to serve longer sentences. So you can't say that that's not systemic. And at every part of that system, the idea that white knowledge is official and black knowledge is not works in that system. It's working in the education system. It works in businesses. And we don't understand this rule that lies sort of beneath the surface that is a sort of common assumption, or just, it's how we don't even notice, like, what is DeSantis doing? Its connection to the history of a slave owner. Okay, well, that's it, and now Shannon will have a discussion. Hello, hello.
Check one. No, it's fine. Yeah.
Yeah, we're fine.
Yeah. I feel like we've basically gotten, an AP history lesson right now here. So, I'm not exactly sure exactly where we're going to go with our conversation, but it's always so illuminating to talk to you. Specifically, I feel about these issues of racial history because you know them so well. I did want to first ask you, this book came out last year in 2022. So it's been out for, has it been out for a year now?
It actually came out in January, so.
Oh, of this year?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. But you wrote it in, when did you write it?
Well, I wrote it, I wrote some of it before 2016, but a big bulk of it, maybe 2/3 between 2016, and then I had was about to hand in the final draft when George Floyd was murdered.
Oh, wow.
And then in the process of rewriting, Dante Wright was killed. So I wrote another little short epigraph about his murder. So, yeah, that period from.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, and in the book, you talk about all those murders which took place here in Minnesota, and sort of elegantly tie them into the wider historical context that we have been living in. But I just wanted to ask you about kind of, have things shifted? I don't know. I've felt, and I've talked to other people who felt, as we've come out of the pandemic, it's just, time is different, and I just wanted to ask you, what has shifted at all for you in terms of, this discussion of white racial narratives and their impact, if anything?
I think it has become increasingly apparent, and it obviously is to many people, that we are undergoing a white backlash.
Yep.
And that backlash was created in many ways during the election of Barack Obama and his presidency. And there was a certain freaking out in portions of the white population. Oh my God, black man is directing the country, it's going to be horrible. And of course, nothing happened horrible, but it was also brought home the realization that after 2040, we will no longer have a white majority population, and that the demographics of the country were changing. And so what you see now in the Republican Party is a rise of anti-democratic authoritarian values. Because one of the things that they realize is eventually we're no longer going to be able to win elections because the Republican Party is only a portion of the white population, and the white population is going to become a racial minority. So we have to figure out, which is not that different from what happened in the South after the Civil War.
Right.
It's like black people were citizens, they were electing black officials to the government, and white people went, no.
They burned them out.
This cannot happen.
Yeah.
And we're going to use terror, we're going to use new legal remedies, we're going to use new laws, and we're going to reinstitute as much as possible all the trappings of slavery.
Yeah, they did. A lot of people didn't realize that, Mississippi had all these state legislatures, the most ever, in Reconstruction.
Yeah.
And these white people burned their houses to the ground, terrorized them. They ran them out.
Yeah, and there was this period of just extreme violence.
Yeah.
But also during that time, many of the policies that we think of as Republican policies were enacted.
Yep.
So, for instance, you had these federal laws which said you cannot discriminate in public space. So what the South did is they closed the amount of space that was considered public. Right? They increased private space. And that still goes on in things like support for private schools. Right?
Yeah.
They enacted the Black Codes, which essentially said that if you're a black person and you weren't literally working for a white person, I mean actually working, the police, but not only the police, any white person could have you arrested. Which explains the origins of today's Karens, right? Is like, I can call the police on black people. I'm not a, I'm just a white woman who hates black people barbecue, right? And I'm going to call the police on them, right? And then once you had those codes, which obviously were applied without any recognition of black rights and arbitrarily, you had over 100,000 black prisoners, and those black prisoners could be hired out as slave labor.
Yeah.
Then you had apprenticeships where, because many black people did not have property, in order to work on farms, they had to become apprentices, and then therefore they owed their apprenticeship to their white owner, and essentially their condition was not very different from being slaves.
Yeah.
Right? So we don't study that history.
Oh, no.
We study the Emancipation Proclamation.
Yep.
And it's like, oh, everybody was free. Everything was great. No, everything was not great.
And we don't study Lincoln, like the real Lincoln, and that he signed the largest lynchings, in the U.S. history, which of course took place here in Minnesota, right?
We don't want to deal with the areas in which the white heroes were not so heroic, right? And in the book I talk about Lincoln, and I say, he was a racist. Now I learned about Lincoln as a great emancipator, and he certainly was a great man, a noble soul in so many ways, eloquent. He saved the Union. He saved this country. And we should all give him praise. But at the same time, we need to realize, like when black ministers came to visit him in the White House, he said, the least white man is better than the best black man. And you will never become a part of America, he told these black ministers. You should go and try to find a home elsewhere. Now, people say, like, okay, but you have to judge Lincoln according to the moral climate of his times, the racial understanding of his times. Well, first of all, we're still not considering the British banned slavery a couple decades before. We're not considering, like, Charles Dickinson visited America, and after one visit, he understood that slavery was a moral abomination. But the other thing we're not doing is you have to judge Lincoln according to the standards of his times. What about those black ministers?
Right.
They believed they were equal.
Yep.
They were part of his times.
Yep.
But we don't, when people say the moral climate of the times, they're not thinking of those black ministers.
Right.
And what there's, remember back in the early 20th century, you had the Negro Leagues. And why do you have the Negro Leagues? It's because black players were not allowed to compete in Major League Baseball.
Right.
Well, what you're creating is a all-white moral league where the black superiority of understanding morals is not even allowed on stage, right? And you're not doing it in 1864 or 1863. You're doing it now. And what you're saying is those black ministers, we don't really consider them as part of the moral climate of their time. Mm-hmm. They're really not part of America then. Mm-hmm. But we're doing it in the present. Mm-hmm. And you're saying, I'm not considering them as part of America. Mm-hmm. And you go back to what I said about white knowledge is always valid, objective, true, and official. At every single point in American history, black Americans were on the right side of history. And the majority of white people were on the wrong side of history. And yet, white America has never turned to black America and said, you know, we got it wrong every single time in our history, and you got it right.
Right.
Maybe we should listen to you now. No. Right? There could be no contemporary equivalent of Martin Luther King Jr., right? No contemporary equivalent of Sojourner Truth, right? It's like all those figures have to also be in the past. They can't be in the present. Mm-hmm.
So I want to ask you too, I mean, in the beginning of the book, which you read from, you sort of establish your own subjectivity and your own investment in this issue of white racial narratives, racial justice, etc. As third generation child of Japanese immigrants. But, you know, so much of the book is about black folks, is, you know, from, you know, and you talked about this too, that, you know, black writers and sort of like the black canon, literary and historical canon. I've heard you talk about this before. You've come to my classes and talked about it with some of my students too. It sort of opened up this counter narrative for you and sort of like a way to, kind of a language to narrate your experience. But I still think it's just interesting for me as a black woman reading this book. Mm-hmm. So much of the information and the historical examples and whatnot are rooted in black history, black writers, black experience. And so I just wanted to ask you, you know, what is your investment in kind of blackness to sort of talk about these white racial narratives as an Asian American?
That's my history. It's just, you know, it's American history. I'm an American. Mm-hmm. Black Americans are part of my history. Native Americans are part of my history. Mm-hmm. Latino Americans are part of my history. Mm-hmm. Arab Americans are part of my history. Mm-hmm. You know, just like my family's imprisonment during World War II is part of the history. Yeah. Just like the fact that, you know, people don't know about this, but you know, at the beginning of the war, America realized, oh shit, we have white Americans who speak Italian. We have white Americans who speak German. We don't have any white Americans who speak Japanese. That's right. What are we going to do? Mm-hmm. And they had to go into the internment camps and recruit people that they had imprisoned because they needed Japanese speakers. Now, these men and women were trained at Fort Snelling and Camp Savage. They went out and served as battlefield guides, battlefield interrogators, and translators of captured messages and documents. And General Willoughby, who was MacArthur's chief of intelligence, said that these Japanese Americans shortened the war in the Pacific by 2 years and saved 1 million American lives. Shortened the war in the Pacific by 2 years and saved 1 million American lives, which means there are anti-Asian, anti-immigrant white people walking around today who owe their existence to these men. So my point is all of this history is mine. Mm. And it's the property of any American, mm-hmm. right? In order to understand that history, you have to understand it. Now, I do think that I've been fortunate to live in this community where I've had so many friends and colleagues who are writers and artists of all different races. Mm-hmm. And there's a way in which, this library is an example of our community, and how much dialogue and cooperation has gone on between people of different ethnic groups, right, and different races, and that has really created an incredible artistic community here that I've grown up to be part of.
You think that's particular to Minnesota?
Yeah, I think so, because for one thing, in other urban areas, they're often rigid geographical segregated lines, right? If you go to Chicago, the majority of black people just live in the west and south side, right? There's a Latino section, right? And whereas, like I quote in the book, Tu Zhejiang was emceeing Hmong Day at the State Fair. And he's shouting from the stage, "How many of you have a black person in your family?" And the Hmong crowd yells. And he says, "Yeah, we all have a black person in our family. We all have a white person too." So it's like that's the way it is in this city, in these cities. It's like and then I've taught for 20 years at VONA, which is a writers' conference for writers of color, and the premise is, we need things like Cave Canem, which is all for black writers, or Macondo, which is all for Latino writers. But having writers from different racial groups together allows them to learn from each other about each other's communities, and that's been part of the VONA ethos. And then I've been fortunate because I've been good friends with two great African-American theorists, Alex Pate, the novelist and educator, and Frank Wilderson, and Frank grew up in the Mary Tyler Moore neighborhood in Kenwood. His family was greeted by a petition of 500 signatures telling them to get out, but they were the first black family in that neighborhood. And I knew both of them before they were famous. Like
Right.
Frank was a stockbroker, and Alex had just left Control Data, and they were both wanting to become writers. So all of that has. I think one of the advantages of being an Asian American writer is that you don't think people are going to pay attention to you automatically,
Right.
or know about you.
Right.
So you understand you have to know everything.
That's very interesting. I feel like that's a quote. That's a David Mura quote. What you just said.
Actually, I'm paraphrasing Carlos Fuentes.
Okay, well.
Because he says, if you come to the United States, you're the big power. Everybody knows about you. You don't have to explain yourself. He says, you come from the country in Latin America, that's not the case, and so we have to know world literature. We have to know everything.
Yeah, that Carlos Fuentes. So I didn't check how much time we actually have.
We want about 8:15 to open up for questions.
What time are we at now? About 20 minutes?
Yeah.
Okay. So I have a few quotes here from the book that I'm going to read. We'll see how many I get through, and then I just want you to talk about them. On page 81. At a deep level, what both white conservatives and liberals share is a common psychology of denial and shame concerning race, a deep desire not to confront the racial realities that shape their lives and the lives of people of color. As a result, most whites don't understand, and they don't want to understand, the whiteness of their epistemologies and ontologies, how they have come to think about their own thinking on race, how the lenses and terms through which they view their own racial identity and those of people of color have been constructed, how that construction is rooted deep in our history. And then you go on in the next paragraph to say, in all this, whiteness is not just a political issue, but a problem of psychological identity and denial, both individually and as a nation. This makes whiteness a problem that can't simply or solely be addressed through legislation or policies, even though you do say in the book that those things are very important as well. So I just wonder if you can sort of, for people who have not read the book, sort of, expand a little bit on, some of the ideas
Well,
there.
I'll tell you a personal story, which is not in the book. So I got a grant to live in Japan in '86, and I wrote a memoir about that. And my wife and I went to see Out of Africa.
Oh, God.
Which is a story of Isak Dinesen,
Sorry.
who's a Danish author, and she married a man who had a plantation in Kenya.
I had a farm in Africa.
And at the beginning of the movie, Meryl Streep dressed in white and that pith helmet that they always wear, she's being ridden by a wagon out to visit her husband's plantation. And all the Africans who work on the plantation come out to greet her, and it's at night, and then there's torchlights, and it's a little ominous. I mean, there's these white people coming into the circle of African people. And I was watching this, and I realized, I was bored. I was bored with the white story of the white Bwana in Africa. I'd seen it over and over, growing up as a kid.
Right.
And I began looking at the black faces. And I began wondering, what are they thinking? Mm-hmm. What are they making of this new white mistress who's coming in to take over the plantation? And I realized, in a couple of decades, they were going to form the Mau Maus in a revolution, which would kick the Europeans out of Kenya. And I was wondering, what are they thinking?
Where's that movie?
Yeah, and I was realizing that I was withdrawing affection, attention, from Meryl Streep's face, mm-hmm. and giving it to the black faces. Mm-hmm. And the world felt differently. Yeah. Now, I was able to do that in part because I knew black people and I had black people that I cared about. But it was suddenly realizing how much I've been taught to view media as an Asian American, identifying with white people and not identifying with black people. Mm-hmm. And the world just felt entirely different when I began to do that. Right? So part of it is about love, as I said. We're supposed to be a Christian nation, aren't we? Russell Moore, who sort of moved himself away from certain aspects of the evangelical movement, has said that now he's had ministers come up to him and say, they preached on the Sermon of the Mount, right? Blessed are the poor, blessed are the meek. And afterwards, parishioners will come up to him and say, where did you get those liberal talking points of the Sermon on the Mount, right?
Wow.
So we are supposed to love everybody, right? We're not supposed to, our love is not supposed to seek, stop at the white neighbor, stop at the Asian neighbor, right?
Right.
But how do you begin to let people do this, right? So now you think about Moms for Liberty, who wants to ban the teaching of the story of Ruby Bridges. Now, Ruby Bridges was a 6-year-old black girl who desegregated a New Orleans school in 1960. And this 6-year-old black girl made it through school through a crowd of jeering, insulting, spitting white people. Now, Moms for Liberty says, that's going to hurt my white children. It's going to make them feel awful.
It's so absurd. It's
my children, who are half Japanese American, half European American, read that, and they didn't feel bad. They felt angry.
Yeah.
They felt a great admiration for the courage of Ruby Bridges, and it set an example to them very early on about the uses of social activism and working for social justice. So the Moms for Liberty either don't think that their white children can be inspired by Ruby Bridges, or really, I think subconsciously, what they're afraid of is that their white children are going to be inspired by that story and identify with Ruby Bridges, and they don't want that to happen. Now, if they were really concerned about the fragility of children, They would be concerned about the fact that every African-American parent must tell their children stories of police brutality and murder in order to prepare them for dealing with the police. What about those stories that Black parents must tell their children? Moms for Liberty could give a hoot about that, right? And if we weren't on the internet, I'd use
right. Right. No, totally. Yeah. I want to also get to, I don't think it's your job to sort of come up with solutions, right? But you get to the, towards the end of the book, you start talking about, what's next?
I talk about for people of color, I say, your job is to make whiteness smaller in your head.
Okay, right.
Because we are all the time thinking about what white people think about us. Mm-hmm. And we have to be aware of it because it forms our environment. Yeah. But we so let their judgments become judgments we make of ourselves. Mm-hmm. And so I tell my students of color, don't give power to people who cannot see you. Right. Don't give the power of judgment to people who can't see you. Yeah. Right? Now, for white people, I say, and this is for everybody, none of us knows enough about race. We all have things we don't know, and we also, to quote John Rumsfeld, we all have things we don't know we don't know.
You just quoted Donald Rumsfeld.
So we're gonna all step in it at one time or another. Yeah. Right? And then the question is, if we make a mistake, we just go, okay, I made a mistake. Tell me how I made a mistake. Let's go on. Mm-hmm. Right? So we should all be learning, which is why partly I object to this idea that you want to guilt people, because all of us can make mistakes. Yeah. You have to allow, it's really the process. Mm-hmm. If people enter a process, you never know, and you have to accept where people are. Mm-hmm. Right? If they don't know a lot, they just don't know a lot. Mm-hmm. But if they have a willingness to learn, and then you have to change your social life, right? If all you're dealing with is people who are exactly like you, you're never going to learn about other communities. Mm-hmm. And it really is going to say something about who you are, right? How you live your life. And if your life is not diverse, you have to figure out how to make it diverse, right? When we say that the most segregated hour of American society is Sunday morning at church, it's like, go to a different church, do different activities. And then finally, you actively, once you've done all this, you begin to work for racial equality in organizing politically, but also in your work, in your institution. There are things you can do about that. But I also say that I think white people go through a set of psychological changes, if they're really progressing, in understanding the issues of race, that are very similar to what Helen Kubler-Ross outlines in On Death of Dying, and the way that we confront death and we don't want to accept the fact of our own mortality. And she calls these the 5 stages of grief. And the first one is denial. The second one is anger. The third one is bargaining. The fourth one is grief. And the fifth one is acceptance. So denial is, there is no racism in America. In fact, white people are more discriminated against than people of color. That's the denial. Then the anger. Why are you bringing it up? We had a perfectly fine community. We had a perfectly fine church. We had a perfectly fine school until you started bringing up these issues about race. You're the one causing the problem, not us. Right? Then it's bargaining. Okay, there's racism, but isn't it just a few bad apples? Right? And as Chris Rock once said, would you want to fly in an airplane that had a few bad apples as pilots? Would you want to be operated on a surgery department that had a few bad apples in it? Of course not. But of course, these issues and the vast racial disparities in every area of our society are systemic. They're not simply individuals. Then it's grief, and sometimes it becomes grief over what America has done or what people of color have gone through. But sometimes it goes like, it is a grief for white innocence, right?
I wonder if you can talk a little bit about that too, like the issue of white innocence.
Well, the psychologist Thomas More said, when we're children, we can be innocent. But the quality of being an adult is understanding that you make mistakes. You may be guilty, and living with it and dealing with it, right? And so it becomes, the whole issue then resides like, I'm not a bad person.
Right.
I'm not a bad person. And I'm not saying you're a bad person because I don't know you.
Right.
I don't know who you are. I'm not saying you're a bad person. I'm saying racism exists in America. Those are two different statements. They're at two different levels, right? And I'm not here to judge, it doesn't work to judge people. But your question of whether you're a bad person or not is not really relevant to addressing this issue, right? But the part of that thing is like I'm a bad person is because part of you feels guilty. Like I as a white, I'll do this experiment. How many people have been stopped 5 times by the police in the last 10 years? Okay. How many people have been stopped 10 times? Okay, that's the one black man. Stop that. Yeah. I'm just sorry for laughing at you.
No,
I'm sorry, but it's just true. Philando Castile was stopped 55 times by the police in 10 years. His mother says it was something like 80 times because some of the stops were not officially registered. Okay, so it is understanding like this works on an individual level, and it's not really about you as a white person. Right? It's about the fact that he had to get up every day. And one of the points I make in the essay is people at the school that he worked at, the Montessori school, loved him. Because he was a great guy. He knew the names of all the kids. He knew which ones had allergies. He knew what their favorite foods were. He knew their names. And they thought, we really like him. But what the white people who knew him didn't realize is every time he got out on the road, he was being pursued. He had to consider that. And so when he greeted those white children with great care and love, he was not just a good person, he was an exceptional person. And so when we say, Martin Luther King says, we should judge each person by their character, not the content, by the content of their character, not the color of their skin, the question becomes, do white people have enough knowledge of black life and what it's like to be black in America to actually judge the character of the black people they know? And
if they know any black people.
If they know any black people, yes. and so the question is, did even those parents who looked favorably on him really understand what he was going through, right? And that's, again, it's not a question whether those parents were good. It's like you understand how extensively and deeply racism permeates our experience of American society and the way we think, the way we feel, the way we identify ourselves. And that's a psychological and spiritual process, in the end, much more than a political process.
Yes. Yeah. And I feel like when I think of whiteness, that word innocence, but it's like innocence dripping with blood, like the blood of people of color.
Yes.
Like it just, and Baldwin talks about that in his writing a lot, like the lie, right? Like the sort of cosmic lie that is at the like the rotten fruit at the center of.
But when you get to the 5th stage and it's just acceptance, you stop spending all this energy trying to push out knowledge.
Yeah.
Trying to push out reality.
Yeah.
Right? And you just accept it. And once that comes, there's a sense of calm, right? A sense of, because it really is about your acceptance of who you are too, right? If I'm white, I benefit from the system. I didn't choose to be part of the system, but I benefit. Just like I as an Asian American, and Asian Americans don't realize it, there's so many things about my life that were possible because of the civil rights struggle, because of the struggle of black people for equal rights for everybody in this country. And it's part of me to acknowledge that. But once you accept all that, it is an acceptance of yourself, but it's a changing What it means is you no longer become attached to these ideas, beliefs, and practices of whiteness, right? And you begin to take apart your white identity. And Baldwin says in this quotation that I constantly use, is identity is a question inducing the most profound panic, a terror as primary as the nightmare of the mortal fall. So he says, like, if we're going to change our identities, it's so threatening to us.
Yeah.
It's like death, confronting death. And you can see this in a portion of conservative white America who thinks, like, God, if we actually open ourselves into this diversity, we're going to die.
Yeah.
And then projects all their hostility and fears onto the population of color, which is a psychological thing, right? I mean, DeSantis walking in this would be horrified. But what is there to be horrified by? It's his own heart speaking.
Yeah.
It's his own psychology speaking fear, right? And he would actually be happier if he let all that go. And he doesn't realize that, right?
Yeah. I think we're going to turn to questions from the audience.
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you, both of you. This is the conciseness with which you have this exchange is refreshing and makes it much easier for us to find the language to talk about this every day, because we always talk about it and wonder if the words mean anything to anyone else. So thank you for that. I just want to say, while I have the opportunity, before I forget, to thank you to Subtext Books, who is here, and we'll have copies of both David and Shannon's books for sale. There are treats in the back as well, so for the folks who are here, you can do that. Also, if you want to get copies of any of their books, you can order from Subtext through their website or walk into their store downtown. So thank you, and thank you all for being here. I don't know, I have so many questions, and we could talk for a very long time, and we will, because we do. We have to keep the conversation going after this, but I'm going to suppress my own question to see if anyone has anything they want to ask to start out with. I'm happy to pose something, but yeah.
All right. Thank you both. You said about 25 minutes ago, there's never been a time where white people said, you know, our track record's actually pretty crappy. What do you think? I would say in that spasm, and it took violence and riots to scare white people to humility in late May, early June of 2020. That was where you saw white people, some white people, falling over ourselves to apologize, to try to find a black friend willing to be a black friend, to be told what to do. And we did it poorly. Corporately, we did it offensively. But I think that led to the CRT backlash. I think it led to DeSantis. It led to this weaponizing of white fragility. And, you know, and I think you were talking about the Daughters of the American Revolution, Confederacy Part 2, whoever that group, like, they're not actually reading the books. But I'm curious, like when you talk about at every step forward, and also a shout out to Dr. Carol Anderson for the White Rage allusions in your book. At every step forward, there's a reaction. And would you say that, is that how you might interpret what's going on now? How would you place this kind of vehement white hysteria now?
I think in many ways it may prove to either be the undoing of the country or the making. You know, that we will move finally closer to those ideals of, you know, freedom, equality, and democracy. But that we have to go through this period, again, of backlash, of racial retrenchment, of a resurgence of white nationalism. And there's been many books in recent years about how, you know, white Christian nationalism really doesn't emphasize Christianity. It emphasizes whiteness. And it is, and it is a psychological fear as much as a political fear. And that's why it's so hard to address, right? And I will say, you said correctly that white people in white institutions, when they began addressing these issues, many mistakes were made. People made mistakes. And I think the thing about working in the issues of race is we have, again, I want to emphasize, we will all make mistakes. And the question is, will you learn from those mistakes? Will you listen to criticism? And if you do that, you will keep moving forward. And if you move forward, you don't know where you're going to be ending up. So I think there is this progression. And obviously young people in the society have grown up with such a different racial climate and understanding. And they're much more diverse. They're much more open to LGBTQ issues. And so their understanding of race, and I think, again, the Republican Party is very fearful of that, right? Because the majority of them are not going to, they're not going to freak out at trans people. They're just not, because that's what they've grown up with. So I have both great hopes, but if we were a true democracy, and by that I mean if we were not structured with South and North Dakota having twice as many senators as California, right? Even though LA is bigger than, has a greater population than South and North Dakota, right? If we were actually functioning not as a republic of states but a democracy, we would be able to overcome some of this. But because Republican legislatures and states can legislate away democratic rights, and because we are at the point of like, where are we going to go with this? And so this next election, and I think the next few elections, are going to be really crucial and an alarm, and people really have to work to ensure that we have a democracy and that these forces arguing really both underneath the surface and actually on the surface against democracy, right, is something we really need to fight. And it's almost as, it's like Reconstruction again, where we lost the battle for democracy, right? We're having another battle for democracy, and we have to win this one.
Yeah, we have a question from our virtual audience. They say, this presentation and conversation is excellent. Much gratitude to David Mura, Shannon Gibney, and ESFL. Are there resources regarding not only the stages of grief, but the developmental stages of unlearning whiteness?
Oh, so many.
Yeah. You're a teacher.
I mean, I just feel like if you even just Google, whiteness, white fragility, like a ton of resources will come out, and there's even workbooks that have been, to your point, everything is both good and bad at the same time. So my understanding is that the first time that there were a majority of Black writers on the New York Times bestseller list was during the George Floyd riots and uprisings in the nonfiction category. It just straight down the line, Ibram X. Kendi and, everybody. So, I think probably both of us could name quite a number of books and resources out there on this topic for further study.
Yeah. I would also say just read the collective writings of James Baldwin.
Baldwin, always go back to Baldwin.
Because the thing about Baldwin is he understood that race was not just a political problem, but a spiritual and psychological problem. Right.
Yeah, we're both Baldwin acolytes.
And he understood that, at a deep level. And he understood that change has to come at those levels, not just political levels.
Thanks. Let's go all the way. Go this way.
So I live in a complex identity where I exist simultaneously as an Anishinaabe, Ojibwe person, and as somebody who is also European in my descendants as well. So one of the things that I think is important, and I'm still working on doing my best with elders and stuff, especially towards David, because I'm sure you've experienced this as well, is how do we work past the members of our community that understand that racism is a problem, but for some reason struggle with the fact that Black Americans and African Americans struggle with more racism in different ways and different systemic issues than we do, and the ways that we've had different privileges, or in some ways just Blackness has had different significant disadvantages. How do we keep pushing that conversation instead of having members of our community go, well, we all experience racism, so all racism is equal, when we know factually it's not. Like Ojibwe and Anishinaabe people like myself are oftentimes much paler, so we end up being in that proximity to whiteness and get a lot more privilege from that. So even just some ways, even for you and how you experienced and worked through it yourself, because I had the luxury of being able to grow up knowing who I am, and I mean, I knew by kindergarten that Christopher Columbus was a very bad man, so I didn't have that same kind of awakening, but I know lots of people are starting to do that, and I think that's a bit of a hindrance I'm noticing as well, is that almost pushback or almost fall back into believing those lies of whiteness because it's more comforting than acknowledging that privilege and disadvantagement exists in these nuanced levels.
Yeah, I don't, in certain ways, it's hard because you can place facts before them, right? If I take my own community, you can place facts about the treatment of Asian Americans, say, by the police or in the healthcare system or economics, and just go look at the statistics. Now, the thing is that people feel about their lives and their conditions based on their experiences, right? And your personal experience is part of who you are, but it can't be your only perception of the world. So it's hard because no one person experiences the totality of race. If you have a highway where people are coming down, and we know statistically, right, that Blacks are more likely to be stopped than Latinos. Latinos are more likely to be stopped than white people and Asians. That's just the fact, right? But nobody who travels on the highway can experience all of that. So it doesn't feel like part of their felt reality, their lived reality. And so part of it is I think also exposing people to other forms of learning, plays, poetry readings, movies, right, where they're relating to the historical circumstances and lives of people, right, and not just statistics and things. And I think the final thing is, I teach because I know if I say something to a 20-year-old or a 25-year-old who disagrees with me, their mind is not set. And even if they disagree with me, I can change them. I don't argue with race with my 96-year-old father. He will never change his views, right? And so it's just like, you have to figure out where change is going to happen, and it really, I think, is with young people. And with the elders, sometimes you go, that's just the way you are. Okay, I accept it, and I need to talk to somebody who I can help, activate in a way that I'm never going to activate my 96-year-old father, right?
Yeah, thanks. Something that you just said, I mean, we talk about the need to overcome and respond to the systems and the systemic aspects of that. But talking about plays and other pieces of art and that sort of thing is like, this is cultural as well. We have this system, but we also have this culture and language that goes with it, which is always being subverted by the supremacist violence. I mean, it's interesting. You started out talking about races having been seen as something in black and white in this country, almost as if, well, the problem is there are these two groups of these two sides that are having this problem, and it's sort of like, well, if they could only just work it out, when really, it's sort of like someone who's being beaten by a mob and saying, I need help, and saying, well, you guys just work it out, or we're not going to listen to you because you're not like a neutral observer to this, so you can't possibly comment on it. And of course, that neutral identity is assigned to the mob. But anyway.
No, and the thing is, all our history is intertwined. If you think about why Asians are in this country, okay, back in the 19th century, California was admitted as a free state, Texas as a slave state. Now, after the Civil War, the problem, California needed labor. They didn't have many black people there. They didn't want black people because black people were citizens and could own land and vote. They didn't want Mexican people there because Mexican people, they had taken the land from Mexicans. They didn't want Native Americans to work because they were busy wiping them out, right?
You gotta love them. You gotta love our
So
history.
it's like, where are we going to
It's
find
just-
labor to exploit?
Right.
So we're going to bring Asian males who cannot be citizens, who cannot own land. We're going to forbid their bringing women so that they can't repopulate.
Right.
They can't vote, they can't own land, and we can kick them out when we want. And they're not going to populate.
Oh, but they can build our railroads.
Yeah, they can build our railroads, right. And so that's why Asians are in this country. And most Asian Americans don't understand that history. That complex set of historical circumstances that brought Asians to California.
Most Black Americans don't understand that history. Most white Americans,
Yeah.
I mean, I don't mean to interrupt you,
Yeah,
but
no,
I just feel like a big part of what this book is bringing forth too is like the massive, colossal failure of history in K through 12, K-16 education. I mean, I went to amazing schools in the 80s and 90s, public schools in Ann Arbor, Michigan, and I still thought that I really didn't like the discipline of history until, of course, I read, people's history, right? And I was like,
Howard's in, yes.
God, if I had learned these stories, right, as you say, like the stories of the Black people versus, the white colonists, like I would have actually been invested in history, So all the histories are intertwined, and then we don't learn them that way. We don't learn them at all, and we don't learn them that way.
No.
Yeah. So many things I want to say. This institution here being founded by, one person who is a historian will complain about the way that history is taught in this country, but that is another conversation that I'm sure we're going to have more of. We're winding up. If it's a real quick question, yeah.
We're on Zoom, so.
Thank you. I was just going to say, isn't the way history is taught today by design?
Oh,
Because
yeah.
Yes.
it upholds the system, the status quo.
Yep.
So it is taught that way very specifically by design to keep us ignorant
Yeah.
of each
Yes.
other's stories.
Yes.
No, my wife grew up in Georgia, and she studied the Civil War as the War of Northern Aggression.
That's just.
That was the way it was taught.
Even.
So the people that went through school, and that's the way they learned about the Civil War. So there's no mistaking about why they think the way they do.
Right.
Because they don't actually know the true history, right? But it's also, I make one small point. I'd say about structures of narratives. If I'm a white author and I go, Bill and Bridget were arguing in their kitchen. Their kitchen window looked out on Broadway, on the Upper West Side of New York. It was a late fall afternoon. Okay, and I go on. You assume that Bill and Bridget are white,
Yes.
right? Now, if I'm saying Tom and Terry were arguing in their Las Vegas kitchen, their picture window looked out on the par 5 13th of the golf course, I would have to say at some point that Tom and Terry are Japanese Americans. I would have to say that they're Nisei, they're second generation Japanese Americans, so that they were imprisoned by the United States government during World War II, and their parents were imprisoned. And that is intrinsic and important to understanding who they are. Now, when the white writer does that, they don't think about it. They just don't even think about it, right? It's unconscious, their use of structure. But what they're saying is whiteness is the rule, everything else is the exception, right? Whiteness is universal, everything else is not. But what they're also saying is Bill and Bridget being white is not important to the way they think about themselves or their life experiences. They just don't think about whiteness. It's not, you know, I'm Bill, I'm a white person. They don't think about it, which is, you know, even white people can recognize that that's not true, but certainly people of color reading that go, no, Bill and Bridget are a white couple, right? You know, I read them as a white couple. I don't read them as a universal couple, right? Just like you wouldn't read Tom and Terry as a universal couple. They're a very specific. So white writers use this and they're not even aware of it. And their position is actually much more like conservative Americans. They're saying race is not important to Bill and Bridget are. It's not important to their identity. It hasn't structured anything about their experience, which is untrue, right? It structured their experiences just as much as my being a Japanese American has had an effect on who I am, how other people deal with me, and also how I think about myself.
And this is also why a lot of the big review publications in the past 5 years have said to their reviewers, you have to designate, sort of when you're talking about a protagonist in a book, you have to designate their racial identity in the review because of, and there's backlash, right? But because of this, right? This sort of implicit assumption, right? That it has been going on for generations. You talk about Playing in the Dark, Toni Morrison's seminal work, right? Where the subtitle is Whiteness in Literary Imagination. And I know your book before this, you really go into that a lot as well. But yeah, it's insidious. It sort of invades your, your the way that you see the world, both externally and internally.
See, in Playing in the Dark, Morrison says, up until very recently, and I would maintain even into the present, white writers did not think about having a black readership.
Right.
They assumed their readership was white.
Yeah.
Now, Toni Morrison said, I'm writing for black people, I'm not writing for white people. But she understood that white readership was important, that she was going to have to pass through white gatekeepers in order to be published, in order to be judged. Yeah. So, and she was obviously aware of how white people think of her and her work, right? Whereas the white writer who goes, like, I'm just writing for people like myself, is not even thinking. I can't write like that, right? Every book I write, I'm thinking like, and I'm determining the economy of explanation, how much I'm going to explain. Right? In my poems, I don't explain a lot because my poems are written for me and other people who read poetry, who I assume will know certain things. This book is written for a more general readership, and I know I have to explain things. But all the time, I'm also, at the beginning, I have to go like, what the hell is an Asian American writing about black-white dialogue? Why am I doing it? You know, where does my bona fides come from, right? Where does my authority come from? I know I have to address that. So, and it goes back to the idea like, oh, the way to be racist is not see race. Well, that's something that white people made up.
Right, totally, totally. This is not benefiting
people of color
at all. No.
I'm saying these definitions of how we're supposed to deal with race, they're not made up by people of color. Right. They're made up by white people, and white people enforce them. And that's how you know we still live in a society of white supremacy.
Right. And all systems of oppression, by definition, gain their power by hiding it. You know.
Yeah.
So in plain sight.
In plain sight. Because you know, as lawyers know, you pick the issue and you pick the definitions, you have won the case. Right. If we define racism as not just conscious acts of declared racism, but it also involves acts of racism where people are hypocritical and don't say it. It also includes acts of racial bias where somebody can consciously believe they're acting without racial bias, but actually are. And there are psychological tests which prove that people do this. I first learned about it from Malcolm Gladwell, who took this Harvard psychological test about unconscious or implicit bias. And he said, I showed implicit bias even though my mother's black.
Yeah.
Right? And so, and then these rules and systems, right? And I could talk on and on, but I just want to mention one more because it always gets me. In McCleskey, which was a case before the Supreme Court, McCleskey was arguing that the death penalty in Georgia was racially biased. Because if you're a black person who killed a white person, you were 70% likely to get the death penalty. If you're a white person who killed a black person, you were 19% going to get the death penalty. So it's a 50% discrepancy, right? And the Supreme Court ruled, well, that discrepancy isn't enough to prove racism. What we need is the Georgia DAs to say, we did this because we hate black people, because we wanted to racially discriminate. And of course, no Georgia DA ever said that, right? And the Supreme Court actually said this. They said, and if we just take up this statistical evidence of racial bias in the legal system, we would have to examine racism throughout the system.
Right. Right.
And we can't do that.
We can't do that.
We can't do that.
We can't do that.
Now, who sets that rule? It's not, again, people of color who set the rule. Like, no, we can't question racism in the legal system.
Oh no, because then you'd be doing critical race theory.
Critical race
And so you can't have that. And you can't look at like the entire foundation,
Yeah.
legal foundation of this country is based on intent, pretty much.
Yeah, and
You
it's
have to prove
it's
intent.
white America has gaslighted people of color throughout our history. Like, if you're a person of color, you look at that 80% if you're a black person killing a white person.
Right.
19% if you're a white person killing a black person.
Gee, something must be going on here. Right.
You know it's racism.
Right.
Right? But the system is telling you, no. According to our definition of racism, racial bias is not present.
Yeah.
So
We have to leave it somewhere.
we have to leave it somewhere
Yes.
because people need treats in the back. And I want to say a lot of stuff. I mean, Alex Pate's words came rushing into my mind, but that's another day. I just want to, first of all, thank everyone on our online audience for joining us. I thank everyone who came here for joining us. I want to mention we have a couple of events coming up very soon. One, we have a Music Between the Stacks series. We have Kashimana coming on Friday. So please come here. Tell your friends. It is going to be amazing. It'll be a nice, intimate space with really great music. I've known Cash for a while, and her music has evolved into something quite amazing. So check that out. Also, Monday, I see Cian smiling there. We're having a Juneteenth celebration brought to us primarily by the East Side Black Business Owners Network. There'll be lots of cool things happening out on the lawn. Please come, have fun, eat. I mean, we wouldn't do this without food. So yeah, that's Monday from 4 to 8. So please join us. Look at our calendar. Sign up for our mailing list. Join more of these conversations. And again, I want to thank both Shannon and David. You two are brilliant. Thank you again for Subtext Books, and thank you everyone else. And good night.
Thank you.
Thank you.